The year is 1804. Tripoli harbor is a pit of absolute blackness, save for the faint, jagged outline of the captured Philadelphia anchored beneath the enemy fortress. Lieutenant Stephen Decatur stands at the railing of the Intrepid, his hands locked around the cold wood. He does not breathe. He watches the frigate, a hulking shadow that now serves as a blade held against his own fleet. The smell of brine and stagnant harbor water hangs heavy. Above the ship, the fortress guns loom, silent but ready to shatter the night with a single signal. Decatur shifts his weight, his boots barely making a sound on the deck. He looks toward the shore, where the enemy patrols move like ghosts along the stone walls. The mission is simple: reclaim the ship or turn it to ash. Failure means the Mediterranean remains a killing ground for merchant ships. Every second spent drifting closer is a gamble against the tide. He feels the weight of the men behind him, their breath shallow, their movements frozen. The silence is not peaceful, it is a physical pressure. Decatur narrows his eyes, locking onto the dark hull of the prize, and mentally marks the distance. The time for waiting is ending. Decatur raised his right hand, a single, sharp motion downward. No words were spoken. The boat dropped from the Intrepid into the water with a dull, heavy thud. He climbed over the side, his boots finding the bottom of the small craft. The rowers gripped the oars, their knuckles white. They pushed away from the larger vessel. The first stroke was too loud. The blade bit into the water with a splash that seemed to echo for miles across the harbor. Decatur gripped the gunwale, his eyes fixed on the looming dark mass of the Philadelphia. Every movement felt like a scream in the silence. The men slowed their pace, dipping the oars with agonizing care, seeking the path of least resistance. The water was glass, reflecting only the absence of light. They moved forward, inch by agonizing inch, the distance closing as the massive, towering hull of the frigate began to blot out the stars above. The air grew colder as they slipped into the shadow cast by the prize. They were now within reach, exposed, and entirely alone in the heart of the enemy's stronghold. The rowers held their breath, waiting for a challenge that could come at any heartbeat. The hull of the Philadelphia loomed above them like a cliff face, a wall of seasoned oak and iron bolts. The boat drifted into the lee of the ship, where the water was perfectly still. Decatur looked up. The deck was 30 feet above, invisible in the gloom. He reached out, his gloved hand pressing against the damp, cold timber. The ship groaned, a deep, structural sound that vibrated through the boat and into his marrow. He signaled for the grappling hook. A sailor reached into the bottom of the boat, pulling out the iron claw wrapped in rags to dull the sound of metal on wood. He swung it once, twice, and cast it upward. It caught the rail with a soft, dull thud. The entire boat swayed. Decatur grabbed the line, testing the weight. It held. The men stood up, their shadows merging with the darker wood of the frigate until they were nothing more than ink stains against the hull. Every man checked his blade, the steel sliding from leather sheaths with a faint, sharp hiss. They were now beneath the very guns that kept the harbor in check. The smell of tar and rot was overwhelming. Decatur gripped the rope, his muscles coiled, feeling the pulse of the enemy just meters above their heads. Decatur went first. His fingers found the gaps between the planks, his boots finding purchase on the thick, wet hemp of the rigging. The ship felt alive under his touch, shifting with the slight current of the harbor. Behind him, the men ascended in a silent, rhythmic line. Suddenly, a rope snapped taut, the sound echoing like a pistol shot against the quiet hull. Decatur froze, pressed flat against the timber, his breath held tight in his chest. Silence returned, heavier than before. He hauled himself the final few feet, reaching the top of the railing, ready to roll onto the deck. A shadow detached itself from the darkness of the mainmast. A watchman, stationed at the starboard rail, turned his head. His eyes widened, fixing on the hands gripping the wood. The man did not hesitate. He opened his mouth, and a guttural, high-pitched scream in Arabic tore through the night air. It was a sound of pure alarm, instantly cutting through the stillness. The secret was gone. The element of surprise had vanished in a single, jagged breath. Decatur hauled himself over the edge, the deck beneath his boots suddenly feeling very small and very exposed. Decatur vaulted the rail, boots slamming onto the deck just as two guards lunged from the shadows. He parried the first strike, the impact vibrating through his arm, and shoved the man back with his shoulder. The deck became a blur of motion. His men poured over the side behind him. their arrival turning the quiet ship into a site of violent upheaval. A guard swung a heavy wood-handled blade, but Decatur ducked. The air whistling over his head, he drove a fist into the guard's ribs, sending him stumbling back against the mainmast. The struggle was frantic, a desperate rush to claim the center of the ship before the alarm reached the shore. Decatur sprinted across the planks, his sword carving a path through the darkness. He intercepted a runner attempting to reach the stairs, slamming him into the gunwale and forcing him over the side into the black water below. Every second mattered. The sound of shouting grew louder as more defenders emerged from the lower decks. Decatur caught the eye of his leadman and pointed toward the hold. They had to clear the deck now, or they would be trapped here. He lunged forward again, his boots sliding on the slick timber, meeting the next wave of guards with a brutal, relentless intensity. The deck was theirs, but the time was running out. Decatur grabbed the nearest man by the arm, pointing toward the hatch leading to the hold. They scrambled down the ladder, the air thick with the smell of old rope and stagnant harbor water. Below, they moved with desperate speed. Men heaved heavy barrels of pitch and sulfur across the floorboards, the wood groaning under the weight. One barrel caught on a protruding nail, stalling their momentum. A man cursed and kicked it free, the wood splintering as it hit the deck. They shoved the containers into the center of the hold, stacking them against the structural supports. Decatur reached into his pouch and pulled out a small box. His hands moved with precision. He struck a match against the rough stone of the crate. The flame flared, blue and orange in the suffocating dark. He held it for a heartbeat, watching the sulfur dust drift through the air. Then, he tossed the match into the heart of the fuel pile. It did not smolder. It roared. The fire caught the pitch instantly, a wall of heat exploding outward, forcing them to shield their faces as the hold became a furnace of white-hot light. The heat hit them like a physical blow, a sudden wall of pressure that turned the air into a searing weight. Decatur stumbled back, the flames climbing the bulkheads with impossible speed. Wood groaned and popped as the internal structure began to buckle under the inferno. He shouted for the men to move, his voice barely cutting through the roar of the fire. They scrambled up the ladder, the rungs already hot to the touch. The deck above was no longer a ship. It was a furnace. Tongues of fire licked at the mainmast, and thick, black smoke billowed upward, choking the night air. Decatur did not look back. He sprinted toward the rail, his lungs burning with every inhalation. The small boat bobbed in the water below, held by a single rope. He hit the rail, vaulted over the side, and dropped into the boat just as the ship's midsection collapsed inward with a thunderous crash. He hit the floorboards, rolled, and pushed himself upright. Above him, the Philadelphia was fully consumed, a towering pillar of light against the dark harbor. He grabbed an oar, locked eyes with his men, and signaled them to row with everything they had left. The first sound was a low, guttural rumble from the fortress walls. Then, the night split open. A massive iron ball tore through the air, hitting the water 20 yards off their starboard side with the force of a falling mountain. A geyser of freezing harbor water erupted, drenching the men and rocking the small boat violently. Decatur gripped the gunwale, his knuckles white, as he shouted for the men to keep their rhythm. They did not slow. The oars dug deep into the churning dark water, pulling them further from the light of the burning frigate. Another cannon fired, the flash blindingly bright against the black horizon. The projectile skipped across the surface, spraying wood splinters and foam into the air just behind their stern. The roar of the artillery was constant now, a thunderous percussion that vibrated through the floorboards. Water splashed over the bow, heavy and cold. Every man leaned into the stroke, eyes fixed forward, ignoring the spray and the deadly spray of debris. The fortress was hunting them by the light of the fire they had just ignited. They were exposed, moving targets in a harbor that had suddenly turned into a shooting gallery. Decatur braced himself as another shot hammered the water, the impact shaking the very frame of the vessel. Sparks rained down like liquid fire, hissing as they struck the surface of the harbor. The men did not look back at the descending embers. They kept their heads down, backs straining with every pull, oars biting deep into the dark, churning water. The air grew suddenly, unnaturally still. Then, the Philadelphia groaned. A secondary explosion ripped through the hull, far louder than the cannon fire. A blinding wall of white-hot light expanded, casting long, jagged shadows against the distant fortress walls. The shockwave hit the boat, A physical thump that pushed the vessel forward and sent spray flying across the deck. The ship was no longer a vessel. It was a massive, hollow torch, its ribs glowing with an intense, internal fury. The mast began to buckle, bending inward toward the heart of the inferno. Decatur watched the flames climb higher, illuminating the entire bay in a harsh, flickering orange. There was no more sound of gunfire from the shore. The fortress seemed paralyzed by the scale of the destruction. The threat was gone. The prize was ash. With the ship now a skeleton of fire, the oarsmen found a new rhythm. Their movements sharp and synchronized, driving the boat away from the heat and into the waiting safety of the dark horizon. The mainmast of the Philadelphia gave way, snapping like a dry twig before disappearing into the heart of the furnace. It was the final anchor of the enemy's strength, now reduced to glowing embers. Decatur stood by the tiller, watching the fire dim as the distance between them and the harbor widened. The heat that had blistered the air only moments ago began to dissipate, replaced by the cool, salt, heavy breeze of the open Mediterranean. Around him, the oarsmen slowed their pace, their heavy breathing gradually returning to a steady rhythm. The frantic tension of the escape ebbed away, leaving a quiet, heavy silence in its wake. There was no cheering. Instead, there was the sound of water against the hull and the distant, dying crackle of the wreckage. Decatur looked at his crew. Each man sat exhausted, eyes fixed on the dark, empty horizon ahead. The threat that had loomed over the American fleet was gone, neutralized in a single night of fire and iron. He nodded to the helmsman, a silent command to hold the course. They turned their backs on the flickering orange glow of the bay and steered into the deep, absolute black of the night. The mission was done. They were going home.